In the final weeks of World War II, the skies over Japan were supposed to be silent. The emperor had surrendered, the Allied forces were preparing for occupation, and for the first time in years, the Pacific seemed calm. But on September 2, 1945, the very day Japan signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri, one American aircraft would vanish into that calm. Its mission, its cargo, and the fate of its 11 crewmen would become one of the most quietly buried mysteries of the war's closing days. The aircraft was a Boeing F-13 Superfortress, an unarmed reconnaissance variant of the B-29, operated by the 6th Reconnaissance Group out of Guam. Its serial number was 44 to 70,145, and it had been retrofitted with some of the most advanced photographic equipment of its time. Vertical and oblique cameras capable of mapping entire cities in a single pass. The crew, led by Captain James Hawk Ellison, had flown nearly 24 missions across the Pacific. They were veterans of the Mariana bombing campaigns and had watched Tokyo burn from 30,000 feet. Now they were told their final assignment was to capture post-surrender imagery of Tokyo Bay and Yokosuka Naval Base. Routine, unarmed, and low risk. Or so it was said. At 0540 hours, the F-13 lifted off from Iwo Jima, one of several forward airstrips still operated by the U.S. Army Air Forces. The flight plan was clear: proceed to Tokyo Bay at 22,000 feet, photograph the bay and naval facilities, then return south by midday. The war was officially over. The crew joked about getting home before Thanksgiving. Yet even before takeoff, there had been unease. The mission orders had arrived just before dawn, stamped "Confidential" by direction of HQ. Ellison's co-pilot, Lieutenant Paul Danner, remarked, "Strange timing for a photo run when the shooting stopped." 2 hours into the flight, at 0745, the crew made their last radio transmission, approaching target area. Weather clear. Beginning first pass. They were flying east of Yokosuka, their cameras whirring as they documented Japanese shipyards still littered with half-sunken destroyers. At 0812, Tokyo Control logged a brief call. Engine trouble, number 3 failing, returning south. Then nothing. The radio went dead. Ground radar tracked the F-13 signal for another 4 minutes before it abruptly disappeared 40 miles southeast of Tokyo Bay. At first, the loss drew little attention. Dozens of aircraft were still patrolling Japan's skies, and mechanical failures were common. But by the next morning, when no distress signals were received and no wreckage had been sighted, the mission commander at Iwo Jima filed a formal missing air crew report. The Pacific was vast and cruel. Aircraft vanished, and so did men. Yet this case was different, because the flight had been unarmed, in clear weather, and over territory already under U.S. control. Eyewitnesses complicated the picture. A destroyer escorting Allied landing teams near Yokosuka reported seeing a trail of black smoke descending over the horizon around 0815 hours, but no crash site was ever found. Japanese fishermen later spoke of hearing a single explosion at sea. A search effort was launched from Okinawa and Iwo Jima, covering hundreds of square miles. Not a single piece of debris was recovered. In a debriefing weeks later, General Barney Giles of the 20th Air Force reportedly remarked, "Reconnaissance is always the first and last act of war." It seems this crew performed both. His words hinted at something unsaid: the quiet continuation of intelligence missions even after Japan's surrender. Indeed, U.S. forces were racing to document potential hidden submarine pens, secret research sites, and underground arsenals before the Soviets could claim them. Ellison's flight might have been part of that race, though officially, it never was. From a surviving page of Sergeant Robert Hayes's flight log, found in a trunk returned to his widow months later, one chilling line stood out: "We thought the war was over. But orders are orders, and someone still wants eyes over Tokyo." It was the last entry he ever wrote. Modern historians looking back note that such reconnaissance missions often operated under overlapping chains of command. Partly Air Force, partly Naval Intelligence, sometimes involving the newly formed Strategic Intelligence Division. The left hand rarely knew what the right was doing. If Ellison's crew had discovered something sensitive, a hidden weapons cache, perhaps, or evidence of Soviet movement. Their disappearance might have been more than an accident. Even today, the coordinates of the final radar contact remain classified in certain U.S. archives. Official reports cite engine failure and loss at sea. Yet, without debris or survivors, such certainty feels hollow. Families were told the crew failed to return from routine observation, and medals were issued quietly, without ceremony. The mystery endures because of what was not recorded: no distress beacon, no flares sighted, and no SOS signal transmitted. The Pacific has swallowed countless secrets, but few with such timing, on the very day peace was declared. For the men aboard the lost F-13, the war never truly ended. And for those who studied the mission in the years to come, one question lingered: if the skies were clear, the engines sound, and the sea calm, what then caused an entire American reconnaissance crew to vanish within sight of Tokyo Bay? The first reports of the missing F-13 reached U.S. Army Air Force's headquarters in Guam 2 days after the disappearance. At first, it was logged as a non-combat operational loss, a phrase that had become all too common in 1945. But when the intelligence office reviewed the final transmissions, something didn't add up. The aircraft's last message, engine trouble, returning south, had been received on a frequency not normally used by its squadron. And more curiously, the radar station at Atsugi had registered a second unidentified blip approaching from the north just minutes before contact was lost. The officer in charge of the investigation was Major William Cross, an analytical, meticulous veteran of the 20th Air Force's intelligence branch. He had seen enough after-action reports to know when something didn't fit the official narrative. Cross began by interviewing the surviving radio operators on Iwo Jima. They recalled the F-13's flight order being delivered by a courier with naval credentials, not Air Force. Top secret, do not duplicate, the envelope had read. The orders rerouted Ellison's aircraft from its original target area north of Tokyo to a new corridor southeast of Yokosuka, without explanation. In peacetime, such inter-branch interference was unusual. In the first days of Japan's surrender, it was unprecedented. One of the most haunting details came from an enlisted ground crewman who had helped load the aircraft before dawn. He swore that in addition to the standard photographic gear, the crew had been issued a sealed metal canister labeled for delivery to base intelligence upon return. No one ever confirmed what was inside. By mid-September, search efforts had expanded to include elements of the U.S. Navy's Task Force 31, responsible for the initial occupation of Japan. Naval logs from the USS Lansdowne, patrolling near Tokyo Bay, describe seeing a single-engine flameout and descending aircraft at approximately 0815, bearing 142. Yet, when destroyers were dispatched to investigate, they found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, not even floating paper maps. Commander E.H. Brackett wrote in his daily report, "Area swept. No contact. Sea calm. Incident unresolved." As the investigation deepened, rumors spread among airmen stationed on Iwo Jima. Some said the F-13 had strayed into a restricted air corridor patrolled by Soviet Yak-9 fighters. Others whispered that the plane had been diverted toward a still-occupied Japanese island to recover something left behind by Imperial Navy engineers. "We heard Ellison's crew had orders not from Guam, but from Washington," one veteran would later recall. In his personal notes, Major Cross expressed unease at how quickly the official narrative shifted. On September 20th, the report's classification level was raised to secret, and all search operations were abruptly terminated. Instructions from HQ. "Cease field inquiries," read the telex. Cross wrote, "Something here smells of policy, not weather." He had served long enough to recognize when the truth was being quietly folded into bureaucracy. Among the personal effects returned to the families was a carbon copy of Captain Ellison's flight manifest. Written in pencil beneath the standard crew list was a curious annotation: Code, Raven. None of the men had used that call sign before. Years later, declassified Air Force memos would reveal that Raven denoted flights operating under joint U.S. naval intelligence supervision. Missions often involving post-strike reconnaissance of sensitive enemy installations. The emotional toll was heavy. The war had just ended. The world was breathing again. For the families of the 11 men, to lose their loved ones in peacetime was almost impossible to bear. Letters from wives and parents poured into Washington. "Please, if he died in action, tell us where," wrote Mary Ellison. The responses came back in form letters. Gracious, bureaucratic, and empty. "We regret to inform you that your husband, Captain James Ellison, is missing and presumed lost at sea. No further details are available." In the mess halls of Iwo Jima and Guam, pilots swapped stories of the lost flight. Some claimed the F-13 had been seen briefly on naval radar south of Tokyo Bay, only to veer sharply east before vanishing. Others insisted Japanese coastal witnesses reported hearing an explosion not in the sea, but inland, perhaps in the remote forests of Chiba Prefecture. But no crash site was ever found, and no Japanese report matched the date or time precisely. A single entry from Sergeant Robert Hayes's journal, his final known words, was later shared among investigators. Orders changed at 0400. Strange feeling about this one. Dana says it's just Recon, but something feels off. Tokyo Bay doesn't need more photos. The war's over. It was both a record and a warning. The disappearance of Ellison's F-13 was becoming less a tragic accident and more a riddle buried beneath classified paper. And behind closed doors, some officers began to suspect that whatever the aircraft was truly photographing that morning, it wasn't for the archives of history, but for the vaults of secrecy. The war may have ended on paper, but in the shadows above Tokyo Bay, another conflict had quietly begun. By October 1945, whispers of the missing F-13 had reached the upper levels of U.S. naval intelligence in Tokyo. The newly established Allied Occupation Command, headquartered in the Daiichi building across from the Imperial Palace, was already grappling with chaos, disarming millions of Japanese soldiers, managing supply shortages, and overseeing the fragile peace. Yet amid all that, a quiet investigation was unfolding behind locked office doors. The question that troubled investigators wasn't just where the aircraft had gone down, but why it was flying a mission no one would admit authorizing. The investigation took a new turn when intercepted Japanese radio traffic from September 2 was decoded. One report, logged by the Japanese Maritime Guard, described an unidentified high-altitude aircraft descending rapidly east of Tokyo Bay, pursued by two smaller planes. The date and time matched the F-13's last known contact. At first glance, it seemed impossible. Japan had surrendered. But the Soviet Union's Far East Air Force had been operating over northern Japan in those same days, monitoring the disarmament process, collecting intelligence, and, in some cases, probing Allied zones. Could Ellison's flight have stumbled into a dangerous airspace overlap? Declassified naval memos from 1946 confirmed that the Office of Naval Intelligence did quietly consider this theory. A cryptic note from Rear Admiral James Forrestal read, "If this was indeed an intercept, it must be treated as a diplomatic matter, not a military one." The language was careful, suggesting a cover-up intended to avoid tensions with Moscow during the delicate first months of peace. Meanwhile, sailors aboard the USS Gosper, anchored near the mouth of Tokyo Bay, came forward years later with their own recollections. One seaman, Harold Sims, recalled seeing a dark aircraft tailing a silver bomber at high altitude around 8 a.m. that morning. It was smaller, faster, and then, poof, both gone into a cloud bank. For decades, Sims's story was dismissed as misremembered, but the timing was uncanny. On land, Japanese civilians along the Chiba coastline told Allied interrogators they'd seen a white aircraft spiraling down, trailing smoke, followed by no explosion, just silence. When asked to pinpoint the site, they gestured to a stretch of sea marked by jagged cliffs and deep coastal trenches, a place where wreckage could vanish completely. American recovery teams scoured the area for weeks. They found only a floating piece of fabric, possibly from an inflatable life raft, and fragments of plexiglass consistent with a camera window. Nothing else. Major Cross, still unofficially attached to the inquiry, pressed for access to radio intercept archives. What he found shocked him: a fragment of an emergency signal transmitted briefly at 0813 hours, 1 minute after the F-13's final radio call. The message was garbled, incomplete, but the letters RAV were clearly audible before static consumed the line. RAV, the start of the plane's secret call sign, Raven. To cross, that was proof the crew had attempted to report something, perhaps an engagement, in their final moments. Soviet archives, opened decades later, would reveal limited details about reconnaissance flights launched from Vladivostok in early September 1945. At least 2 Yak-9 fighters were reportedly dispatched toward the Kanto region to monitor U.S. air activity. The records did not confirm contact, but they did note loss of radio communication at 0815 that same morning. Still, no evidence linked the Soviets definitively to the disappearance. And the official U.S. position remained unchanged: mechanical failure, presumed crash at sea. Yet behind closed doors, the mood was shifting. Too many inconsistencies, too many missing pages. The silence, Cross wrote in his journal, is louder than the truth. In his 1947 testimony before the Joint Army-Navy Review Board, Cross described a culture of secrecy that pervaded post-war intelligence. We were told the war had ended. But for those of us in intelligence, the line between peace and espionage was already gone. His words were stricken from the final transcript. Years later, fragments of the missing F-13's mission plan surfaced in a batch of declassified microfilm. Grainy photos of coastal shipyards, airfields, and one curious image labeled only Target 14B, restricted area. The coordinates pointed to a small peninsula near Yokosuka, once home to a submarine research base destroyed before occupation. Why photograph a facility already in ruins? Unless, as some believed, it wasn't as empty as claimed. As speculation grew, one quiet truth emerged. Ellison's crew had likely been flying a mission far more sensitive than routine photography. Whether it was to document hidden weapons caches, track Soviet ships, or confirm intelligence about experimental Japanese technology, no one would ever say. What is certain is that they flew into contested skies that morning, unarmed, unaware, and entirely expendable. By the winter of 1945, the official inquiry was quietly closed. No ceremony marked its end, no press release acknowledged its findings. But within the classified files of both Washington and Tokyo, a red-stamped note remained, Case Raven, pending further intelligence. And though the war was over, the shadows it cast had only just begun to move. By 1946, the war's visible scars were healing, but in the corridors of American intelligence, the shadow of the lost F-13 refused to fade. When declassified memos began to circulate within the Strategic Air Command, new details emerged, some so sensitive they were immediately reclassified. Among them was a notation buried in a 1946 ONI report. F-13 equipped with prototype IR reconnaissance package. Model K-22, photographic system under evaluation by Wright Field. That revelation changed everything. The F-13 had not been conducting a routine mapping run. It was testing a classified camera capable of detecting heat signatures from hidden bunkers and underwater structures, technology years ahead of its time. The mission's true objective, as later pieced together by historians, was part of Operation Sunset, a joint U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy effort to identify and document secret Imperial Japanese research sites before Soviet teams could reach them. Intelligence officers believed that remnants of Japan's advanced weapons programs, including submarine-launched missile prototypes and experimental aircraft, were still concealed in underground bases near Tokyo Bay. The Ellison cruise assignment, sources suggested, was to photograph those locations under the cover of a post-surrender survey. Documents released decades later revealed that the F-13's planned flight path skirted over Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, once home to Japan's largest submarine construction docks, and extended southeast toward Tadayama, where rumors persisted of hidden underwater tunnels. The infrared equipment on board could have confirmed those sites' existence from 20,000 feet. But in doing so, it might have revealed the same intelligence that others wanted kept secret. In early 1946, the U.S. Navy quietly retrieved a fisherman's letter delivered through the Japanese Coast Guard. It described seeing a great silver plane burning above the sea, with no parachutes, and then nothing. The man had marked the location on a hand-drawn map near the Nojimazaki Cape. Naval divers were dispatched under the pretense of mine clearing. Their logbook later recorded unauthorized recovery of metallic components, with the page following it torn out. Those divers were never publicly identified. One of the few officials who pursued the case further was Commander Thomas Halloran, a naval intelligence officer stationed in Yokosuka. In a letter to a colleague, Halloran wrote, "We have pieces of something larger than wreckage, something meant not to be found. The orders to stop digging come faster than the divers' reports." He was reassigned to Pearl Harbor within weeks, and his correspondence ceased. Meanwhile, rumors within Allied headquarters suggested the Japanese themselves might have been cooperating with Soviet agents to protect research data from being seized by the Americans. Declassified Soviet reports later referenced scientific transfers occurring around that same coastal area in September 1945. If the F-13 had captured images of such activity, perhaps Soviet ships or Japanese installations still active, its disappearance might have been more than a tragic accident. It could have been silenced to prevent a diplomatic crisis, just as post-war alliances were being drawn. In Tokyo, reconstruction had begun. The sight of American officers walking through the ruins of the Imperial Palace grounds had become routine. Yet somewhere beneath the formal occupation and carefully written reports, the legacy of the missing flight gnawed at those who knew even fragments of the truth. It was peace on paper, Halloran later told an interviewer, but a war of silence in practice. The mystery took another twist when, in 1950, a classified photo-negative labeled R145, Bay Sector South, surfaced in an Air Technical Intelligence file at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The image, badly degraded, appeared to show part of Tokyo Bay's southern coastline with faint outlines of cylindrical structures beneath shallow water. The provenance of the film was never explained, but its numbering matched the serial of Ellison's missing aircraft, 44 to 70,145. Whether it had been recovered from the wreck or another source remains unknown. Historians who reviewed the surviving documentation believe that the F-13 may have uncovered evidence of an underground weapons network connecting Yokosuka's naval tunnels to secret depots further inland, an operation both the US and Soviet Union had motives to suppress. If so, the engine failure message could have been code, a final signal before interception or intentional downing. As the years passed, files labeled Case Raven were quietly transferred into long-term storage, sealed under Cold War classification rules. The families of the lost airmen never received closure, only folded flags and vague words of honor. Yet fragments of the truth, recovered logs, half-burned memos, a fisherman's sketch, continue to wash up like tide-carried debris. Standing on the bluffs above Tokyo Bay today, one might see only tranquil waters and bustling ports. But 75 feet below the surface, sonar scans reveal irregular shapes, metallic contours buried in sediment. Are they remnants of Japan's lost war machines, or pieces of Ellison's F-13? No one can say. The ocean keeps its own secrets, and in 1946, it seemed determined to keep this one forever. By the 1950s, the story of the lost F-13 had nearly vanished from official memory, buried beneath the growing tension of the Cold War. Yet for those who remembered, the silence around the case spoke louder than any conclusion. Families received folded flags and certificates of service, but little else. Missing, presumed lost, the telegrams read. What few knew was that, in intelligence circles, Case Raven had not been forgotten, it had merely changed hands. In 1952, as the United States consolidated its post-war intelligence agencies, fragments of the F-13 investigation were quietly transferred to the newly formed CIA. There, the files were stored under a new reference code, Operation Hawkeye. The change of name obscured its origins. Only a handful of analysts even knew it referred to a lost reconnaissance mission over Tokyo Bay. One such analyst, a young Air Force veteran named Edward Lang, later testified that when he reviewed the file, half of the original documents were missing, and the rest were stamped with dual seals, USAF and ONI. That usually meant something had gone very wrong. Then, in 1957, a peculiar discovery jolted the case back into relevance. American intelligence officers operating in Yokohama's black market recovered a damaged aerial camera offered for sale by a local trader. The serial number, K22-145, matched the exact infrared unit assigned to Ellison's F-13. The camera was heavily corroded, its lenses shattered, but portions of the film mechanism remained intact. When tested, fragments of film were found still rolled within the casing, though exposure and moisture had destroyed almost all imagery. Still, one faint frame was distinguishable, a blurred coastline, possibly Yokosuka, and what appeared to be the shadow of a large, unfamiliar vessel at anchor. The discovery prompted a flurry of quiet correspondence between Tokyo and Washington. The official response from the U.S. Air Force was terse. Item recovered not verifiably associated with MACR number 14921. No further action required. Unofficially, however, Naval Intelligence launched a brief internal review, led by Commander Halloran, reinstated after years of silence. His conclusion, filed under restricted classification, read, recovered material consistent with aircraft F-13, serial 44 to 70,145. Film damage prevents analysis. Probable recovery from unauthorized salvage. Within days, the file was sealed again. Historians who later examined the case believe the recovered camera hinted at something far deeper. The F-13's flight path and specialized equipment suggested its mission may have overlapped with early U.S. monitoring of Soviet naval activity near Japan. By 1945, the Soviets were already dismantling Japanese industrial sites in northern Honshu, transferring scientists and materials eastward. If Ellison's crew had photographed one such operation in progress, their findings might have revealed the first glimpses of the post-war intelligence struggle, a conflict neither side wanted made public. Among the few personal voices that survive from that period is a letter from Lieutenant Paul Danner's widow, written to the Air Force in 1958. She wrote, "I no longer ask what happened to Paul. I ask only why no one will say what he was doing when he died." Her plea went unanswered. In 1961, a journalist with Stars and Stripes, investigating wartime aviation losses, attempted to locate the original Case Raven file. He was informed the material was transferred to National Archives pending review. When he visited Washington, the reference number led only to an empty folder marked "Removed for Security, 1960." The contents were gone. Meanwhile, the story lingered among veteran circles like an old, unspoken wound. Some swore they'd seen parts of the F-13 fuselage hauled aboard a U.S. Navy barge in 1946 before vanishing into classified storage at Yokosuka. Others claimed the aircraft had made an emergency ditching near the Chiba coast and was later destroyed to conceal its true mission. None of the accounts could be verified, but all shared the same undercurrent of secrecy and unease. For intelligence officers of the 1950s, Ellison's flight represented a turning point, the moment when reconnaissance blurred into espionage and truth into utility. The missing aircraft was no longer a story of wartime tragedy. It had become a parable of the new global order. As Major Cross, by then long retired, wrote in his unpublished memoir, "We used to say the sea buried secrets. But in truth, it was men who buried them, layer upon layer of ink and silence." In time, Case Raven slipped quietly from active files, its name erased from briefings and indexes. But the recovered camera, its rusted metal and fractured lenses, remained locked in a secure vault at Yokosuka Naval Base. Its single surviving frame, that faint shadow over the water, would haunt those who saw it. Some said it showed a Soviet vessel. Others thought it was the outline of something older, something that should never have been there at all. Whatever truth it captured was left to decay, forgotten by those who buried it and unknown to those who would one day seek it. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, had taken the men of the F-13. History, just as vast, had taken the rest. Nearly 80 years have passed since the F-13 vanished into the gray skies over Tokyo Bay, yet its shadow lingers across the pages of military history. What began as a routine reconnaissance flight in the closing hours of World War II became one of the most enduring mysteries of the Pacific. The loss was never just about a missing plane. It was about what the men aboard might have seen, and why their discovery had to disappear with them. By the late 1970s, a new generation of historians and researchers began digging into declassified archives. Among them was Dr. Helen Stratton, a defense analyst specializing in Cold War intelligence. Her 1981 study, The Vanished Recon Mission, cross-referenced U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Soviet records. What she uncovered hinted at a convergence of events on September 2, 1945, U.S. reconnaissance flights, Soviet air patrols, and the evacuation of secret Japanese research materials from coastal tunnels near Tateyama. If Ellison's crew photographed any of this, Stratton wrote, their images would have been politically explosive. Her paper was cited in a handful of military journals, then mysteriously withdrawn from circulation within months. Modern sonar surveys of Tokyo Bay have deepened the intrigue. In 1998, a joint Japanese-American research team mapping undersea topography for environmental studies detected large metallic anomalies buried beneath silt near the coordinates once associated with the F-13's radar echo. The objects were cylindrical, roughly the dimensions of a bomber's fuselage, yet neither the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force nor the U.S. Navy authorized an excavation. Environmental sensitivity, they said, two words that effectively ended further investigation. Some of the sonar operators later admitted that the data tapes from that expedition were quietly collected by U.S. officials before publication. Today, historians interpret the disappearance through three main theories. The first, catastrophic engine failure leading to an unrecoverable crash, consistent with the aircraft's final message. The second, an accidental intercept by Soviet aircraft, later hushed to preserve post-war diplomacy. The third, and most controversial, suggests that the F-13 was deliberately downed or suppressed by Allied command after capturing evidence tied to Operation Sunset's classified objectives. None can be proven, and each raises more questions than it answers. Families of the lost crewmen have continued to seek recognition. In 2002, descendants petitioned the Pentagon for declassification of Case Raven. Their request was denied on grounds of national security relevance. The phrasing was striking. After 57 years, what could still be relevant about an unarmed reconnaissance flight? It's not the wreckage they're protecting, one historian commented. It's the context. Even in popular culture, the story occasionally resurfaces. Documentaries on wartime aviation list the F-13 among unsolved Pacific disappearances, while online forums trade theories about secret cameras, Soviet encounters, and hidden weapons caches beneath Tokyo Bay. Yet, despite the fascination, the official record remains unchanged. Mission incomplete, aircraft lost at sea, 11 airmen missing. Standing on the observation deck of the Yokosuka Naval Port today, one can look across the same waters Ellison's crew flew over. Cargo ships trace steady lines where reconnaissance planes once raced through danger. Beneath them lies a silence older than the peace treaty itself. They vanished after the war had ended, Dr. Stratton once reflected. Perhaps that's why we never truly looked for them. The world was tired of war, and truth would have spoiled the calm. The legacy of the F-13's disappearance endures as both caution and reminder. It tells of men who carried out their duty to the very end, of a mission swallowed by diplomacy and time, and of a post-war world already shifting into the secrecy of a new conflict. The Pacific may have buried their aircraft, but it has not buried their question, a question as relevant now as it was in 1945. What price are we willing to pay for the truth we choose to forget? Somewhere beneath the surface of Tokyo Bay, 11 airmen still lie in silence. Their cameras are long gone, their photographs never seen. Yet their story remains a mirror to the hidden wars fought in peace, a testament to the men who flew into history's blind spot and never came home.